My name is Velma Bertrand. I'm 28 years old. And last Saturday night at my sister's engagement party, my mother introduced me to a room full of strangers by saying, "Oh, this is my other daughter. She cleans floors for a living." My father chuckled. "Every family's got one." The room laughed politely, the way rooms do when they don't know what else to do. But the groom's father didn't laugh. His name is Nelson Granger. And when his eyes dropped to the scar across my left palm, that long, curved mark I've carried for 3 years, his smile disappeared completely. He stood up slowly, pulled his napkin from his lap, and said quietly, "Could I speak with you outside?" I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know what he knew. What happened next changed everything, not loudly, quietly, the way the truth usually does. If you want to hear what happened, stay with me. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're from and what time it is there, and let's begin at the beginning. There were 14 framed photos in that living room. I counted once, a long time ago, on a Sunday afternoon when everyone else was out and I had nothing but time and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being inside a house that doesn't quite feel like home. 14 photos. I appeared in 3 of them. Group shots. Christmas, a cousin's wedding, one 4th of July, where I was partially cut off at the edge of the frame. Fiona had her own wall. 6 portraits, individually lit, professionally framed. Her college graduation in the center, the largest, matted in cream with a gold border. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because that wall is where the story really starts. The house was on Trad Street in Charleston. 3 floors, historic architecture, a garden out front that my mother tended with the kind of care she reserved for things people could see, white window boxes, trimmed hedges, a brass knocker on the front door that she polished every Saturday morning without fail. From the outside, it was exactly the kind of house that made people slow down when they walked past. Inside, it was quieter in the ways that mattered. My father, Howard Bertrand, was a professor of history at the College of Charleston. 58 years old, silver at the temples, reading glasses always on the end of his nose. He had a voice that was measured and deliberate, every sentence constructed, every word chosen. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had something more effective, the quiet, considered sentence that left no room for a response. He'd been married to my mother for 31 years. They had built, together, a very specific life, one in which appearances were managed, narratives were controlled, and every member of the family understood their assigned role. Fiona's role was pride. Mine was something else. My mother, Sylvia Bertrand, was 56 and had been the president of the Charleston Heritage Women's Circle for 4 consecutive terms. She kept her business cards in a slim gold holder in every purse she owned, cards printed with raised lettering, her title beneath her name. She was the kind of woman who made people feel immediately evaluated when they entered a room. Not unkind exactly, just precise, everything in its place, everyone in their category. Fiona was 31. She'd left home at 18 for a university in Virginia, built a life there, come back to Charleston 3 years ago for a job she loved. She was genuinely warm. I want to be fair about that. There were moments between just the 2 of us, sitting on her apartment balcony with takeout containers and bad television, when she was fully and completely my sister. When she laughed at the same things I laughed at. When she reached over and squeezed my shoulder for no reason. But she had grown up inside the same house I had. And what she learned there, what we both learned, was that there was a way things were done. And the way things were done meant that certain conversations didn't happen, certain dynamics weren't named. Fiona wasn't cruel. She had simply never been the target, and that made her, in certain important ways, blind. The Friday night dinners were mandatory. That was the word my mother used. Not a request, not a tradition, but a standing arrangement that you canceled at social cost. I had missed 4 in the past year. Each absence was noted. It was at one of those dinners, 6 weeks before the engagement party, that Fiona came home with news. She and Sebastian Granger had been together for 2 years. He'd proposed. She said yes. My mother's reaction was immediate and complete. She stood up from her chair and crossed the room and held Fiona the way she held things she was proud of, fully, without reservation. My father raised his glass, the room filled with the kind of warmth that I had stopped expecting to be included in. I smiled. I meant it. Fiona deserved to be happy. But as my mother pulled back from the embrace, her eyes swept the room, a quick, practiced survey. And for just a moment they landed on me. Not with malice, with something more familiar than that. A reminder. A preemptive instruction delivered entirely without words. Don't make this complicated. I looked down at my plate. I already knew I wouldn't. What I didn't know was what was coming 6 weeks later. I didn't know who Sebastian's father was. I didn't know what he carried, or what he'd been looking for, or that he'd find it in the last place anyone in that room would have thought to look. I want to explain what growing up in that house actually felt like, because I think people sometimes imagine that the kind of family I'm describing is dramatic, full of confrontations and slammed doors and obvious villains. It wasn't like that. That's partly what made it so hard to name. My father's method was comparison. It was so consistent and so practiced that for years I thought it was just the way parents spoke. Every result I brought home was placed beside Fiona's results and measured. My A- in sophomore English. Fiona held a 4.0 her whole junior year. The regional debate award I won at 16. Fiona's getting honors credit this semester. Not dismissal. Never outright dismissal. Just context. Just framing. Just the steady, quiet implication that whatever I had done was a starting point, not an arrival. He'd say, "That's a good start, Velma." The word start did all the damage. Like everything I did was just a rehearsal for something I'd never actually reach. His study had a shelf, a full shelf, dedicated to Fiona's academic achievements. Trophies, certificates, framed letters of commendation. I had won second place in a statewide junior business competition at 17. Howard had a faculty dinner that evening. He sent a text that said, "Heard you did well, proud, no period at the end." My mother's method was different, and in some ways more total. Sylvia didn't compare me to Fiona directly. She performed disappointment. In public. With great consistency. At her women's circle gatherings, at church, at the neighborhood events she helped organize. She spoke about me in a register that I can only describe as loving regret. Velma is still finding her way. We worry about her, you know how it is. Fiona has always been more focused. These weren't lies exactly. They were constructions. They built a version of me in the minds of everyone around us. A version that existed before they'd ever spoken to me. I walked into rooms already defined. I was 22 when I overheard the phone call. I'd stopped by the house to return a book. The front door was unlocked, the way it always was on weekday afternoons. My mother was in the kitchen, voice carrying clearly down the hallway. I heard my name. I stopped. "Fiona is our pride," she said. "Velma. We just hope she figures it out before it's too late." I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I set the book down on the entryway table, turned around, and left. That was the last time I cried because of them. I had moved out 2 years earlier, at 20, with $800 in a checking account and one bag of clothes. It wasn't a dramatic departure. No argument, no ultimatum. Just a Monday morning, when I understood clearly that staying was costing me something I couldn't afford to keep losing. I left a note on the kitchen counter. "I'll call when I'm settled." I did call. They answered. Life continued in its rearranged form. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously for the next 2 years. Mornings, housekeeping at a mid-range hotel near the airport. Afternoons, cashier at a grocery store off Folly Road. Evenings, commercial cleaning for a small office building on Meeting Street. I was taking classes at Trident Technical College on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Property management certification, business fundamentals, one accounting course I nearly failed and retook. Howard refused to co-sign my student loan applications. Twice. The first time he said he'd forgotten. The second time, there wasn't enough time before the deadline. I waited for a third opportunity that never came, then found another way. I always found another way. There's a notebook from those years, small, green cover, spiral bound, where I tracked every dollar. Weekly income on the left column, expenses on the right, rent, utilities, food, transportation, tuition. The total at the bottom of every page was never negative. I made sure of that. By the time I was 23, I had $14,000 saved and a clear picture of what I wanted to build. The idea had been forming for a long time, years of working inside properties, watching what got neglected, understanding how buildings functioned at the level most owners never saw. I knew what deferred maintenance looked like before it became expensive. I knew which vendors cut corners and which ones didn't. I knew from the inside out how property management actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. I heard about a small company, cleaning and property management services, 12 clients, aging owner who wanted to retire, that was being sold for $60,000. The owner was willing to negotiate. I offered $48,000, everything I had, plus a small business loan I qualified for on my own. He said yes. I remember sitting in my car after the meeting, in the parking lot of a Publix on James Island, for about 10 minutes. Not celebrating, just breathing. Then I drove to the bank, opened a business account, and wrote down the name I'd already decided on months earlier. Bertrand Property Services. Not because I was proud of the name, because it was mine before it was theirs to define, and I wasn't going to let them keep it. If you're still here, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever built something in silence that the people closest to you knew nothing about, I'd really like to hear that. November 2022. I was 25 years old, and the company was 2 years old, and things were beginning to work. I had 21 employees by then. The client list had grown steadily. Mostly commercial properties, a few high-end residential buildings, 2 small boutique hotels that found us through referral. I was still doing fieldwork myself, not because I had to, but because I believed you couldn't manage what you didn't understand, and I was still in the phase of understanding everything I could. The property on James Island was a waterfront estate in Rockville, a historic structure built in the 1920s, recently inherited, the new owner looking for a management company before listing it for sale. I'd driven out to do the initial assessment myself, late afternoon. The kind of November light that turns everything gold before it disappears. The main house was in good condition. The dock was not. It stretched about 30 feet over the water. Old wood, most of it still solid, but the last 10 feet were compromised. I'd noted it in the first 5 minutes, flagged it on my clipboard with a circle and the word, "Do not use." 3 items left on my checklist. I was working through them from the far end of the property, moving back toward the house. That's when I heard it. Not a crash, more of a crack and a hollow thud, followed by silence. I looked toward the dock. A man was down. He was wearing a dark suit, which meant he'd come dressed for a meeting, not a site visit, which meant he hadn't understood what he was walking into. He was older, somewhere in his 60s, and he had broken through the compromised section at the far end. The upper half of his body was on the remaining surface. His legs were tangled in the broken planks below. The tide was coming in. I could see the waterline. I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. I ran. He wasn't panicking. That was the part that scared me most. He was just very, very still. The particular stillness of someone who understood their situation and was conserving everything. I assessed in seconds. The planks weren't stable enough to support my full weight at the broken point. I needed leverage. There was a length of old mooring rope coiled near the dock's base. I looped it around a piling, used it to distribute my weight, and got close enough to reach him. The wood was splintered in every direction. I got my hands under his arms and pulled. The first attempt moved him 6 inches, the second, another 8. On the third, a jagged piece of broken plank rotated upward as I shifted position and caught me across the left palm. A clean, deep draw from the base of my index finger to the heel of my hand. I didn't stop. 2 more pulls. He cleared the broken section. I got him to the solid part of the dock, then to the grass at the shore. He was breathing, conscious enough to respond to his name when I asked, though I didn't know his name, so I just said, "Sir, stay with me," and he said something low that I couldn't hear clearly. I called 911 at 4:53 p.m., 6 minutes from the crack of the wood. The dispatcher said the nearest unit was 8 minutes out. I sat with him, kept him talking, kept him still. The temperature of the water had been 58 degrees. He'd been partially submerged for most of those 6 minutes. His color was coming back slowly. At 5:11 p.m., I heard sirens from the road. I picked up my clipboard. The last 3 items on my checklist were still unchecked. There was blood on the bottom corner of the page, a full red print from my left hand that had dried into the paper. I folded the page inward, tucked the clipboard under my arm, and walked to my truck. I did not stay to be identified. I did not leave my name with the property or the 911 call. I had learned by then that staying to be seen wasn't something I was built to expect. And there was a version of me at 25 that believed that was simply the way things were. That night, in a hotel room off the interstate, I looked at the cut in the mirror above the sink. Long, curved, already starting to close. I thought about calling Fiona. I picked up my phone. I set it back down on the bathroom counter without unlocking it. Some things you just carry alone. By the time I was 26, Bertrand Property Services had 20 employees and was billing just under $1 million a year. By 27, we'd crossed 800,000, and I was starting to look at what the next phase could be. By 28, the December that this story takes place, we had 52 employees, annual revenue of $3.1 million, and a client roster that included some of the most well-regarded properties in Charleston and the surrounding Low Country. My family did not know any of this. This was not an accident. I want to be precise about why I made that choice, because it wasn't spite, it wasn't revenge, it was something colder and more considered than either of those things. I had watched, for years, how my parents related to things of value, how they assessed, how they categorized, how quickly and completely love became conditional on performance and appearances. And I understood, with clarity that took some years to arrive at, that if I introduced money into my relationship with them, money would become the entire relationship. They would want things. They would want access. They would want the story. Our daughter built a company to circulate in the women's circle and the faculty lounges and the heritage dinners with their names attached to it. And I would never know whether they had actually seen me or whether they had simply updated my category. So I gave them nothing to update. I said I cleaned floors. Which was true, in the sense that I started there, and in the sense that our crews still cleaned floors as part of our service contracts. I said it simply, without elaboration, and changed the subject. And over time they stopped asking because they assumed they already knew. The office was at 114 Calhoun Street, a historic commercial building 2 blocks off the main corridor, 3,000 square feet on the second floor. I had renovated it myself on weekends over a 6-month period. Paint, trim, lighting, the reception desk that I'd found at an estate sale, and refinished in my parking space. The sign on the door read Bertrand Property Services, in brushed bronze lettering that I had installed on a Saturday morning when the street was quiet and no one was watching. I stood on the sidewalk after, looking up at it for about 30 seconds. Then I went inside and answered emails. The work itself was the thing I loved, not the revenue, not the recognition, the actual work of understanding a building, understanding what it needed, building teams that could deliver consistently. I had a director of operations, a head of client relations, 3 regional supervisors. I had systems and protocols that I'd written myself over 3 years of iteration. We had a reputation in the commercial property sector that I was proud of, not because people said nice things, but because our contract renewal rate was 91%, and in this industry that number speaks for itself. In the spring of 2024, we received an inquiry through a commercial brokerage that we sometimes worked with, a request for proposal from a company looking to outsource management for 6 waterfront and historic properties in the Charleston area. High-value assets, significant scope, the kind of contract that doesn't come through the standard channels very often. The company was Granger Estate Group. I knew the name. In Charleston real estate, you knew the name. Nelson Granger had built his firm over 3 decades, historic properties, waterfront estates, mixed-use developments, the kind of portfolio that represented not just investment, but genuine institutional knowledge of the city. His company's reputation was immaculate. I put together the proposal myself. It took 4 days. I priced it correctly. Not low to win, but accurate to what the work required. I submitted it on a Tuesday. 2 weeks later, we were awarded the contract. The confirmation email arrived at 6:43 in the evening. I was at the office, alone, the last one there. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to our legal counsel with a note that said, "Please review and confirm by end of week." Then I sat in my chair and looked out the window at the lights coming on along Calhoun Street. I thought about calling Fiona, not my parents, Fiona. I thought about saying, "I just signed the biggest contract in the company's history." I thought about hearing her say, "What company?" and having to explain all of it, from the beginning, and watching the conversation become about why I hadn't told her sooner, why I'd kept it from the family, what that meant about us. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Maybe I was protecting myself. Maybe I was protecting the thing I'd built from the weight of their reactions before I was ready to carry it. I put the phone back in my bag. I signed the Granger contract on March 14th, 2024. 6 properties. The work was excellent. I know that not because I say so. I know it because the contract renewal conversation happened in October 2024 without a single performance concern raised, and because our regional supervisor for that portfolio told me, quietly, that the client contact at Granger had used the word exceptional in an internal email. I never met Nelson Granger. Our communication happened through intermediaries and formal channels. He was a name on a contract, and I was a name on a contract, and the work was its own conversation between us that neither of us knew we were having. Until December. The invitation arrived by mail. Not a text, not a phone call. An envelope with a Trad Street return address, forwarded to my office, because that was the address my family had for me. The card inside was cream-colored, embossed, exactly the kind of stationery my mother bought in bulk from a shop on King Street. In the lower left corner, written in my mother's handwriting, in red ink. "Please dress appropriately." I read that line twice. Then I set the card down on the corner of my desk, next to the Granger Estate Group renewal file. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I sat with the decision for 3 days. Not because I was dramatic about it, but because I had learned over many years to calculate the cost of these events in advance, what they would take from me, whether I had enough in reserve to absorb it. Then Fiona called. Not a text. She called, which she did when something mattered. She said, "Vel, please, I want you there. Not for Mom, not for the optics. I want my sister at my engagement party." Her voice was real, the kind of real that doesn't perform. I said yes. The venue was the William Aiken House on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's most recognized historic event spaces. A Greek Revival antebellum mansion with white columns, wide verandas, and interior rooms that had been hosting Charleston society events for over a century. I had quoted a cleaning contract for this property 2 years earlier. They had gone with a larger firm. I remembered thinking, at the time, that their loss was coming. I arrived 12 minutes late, intentionally, not from rudeness, but from the particular self-preservation that comes from not wanting to stand near the door while guests arrive and my mother manages introductions. Better to walk in when the room was already moving. A valet took my car. I walked up the front steps alone, in a navy dress I had chosen myself. Simple, well cut, nothing that invited commentary. I paused at the entrance for a moment, looked at the marble floor of the foyer. I had cleaned floors that looked exactly like this one. The room held 34 guests. Round tables with white linens and low floral arrangements. White roses and eucalyptus, my mother's preferred combination. Soft string quartet music. Candlelight. The kind of setting that made everything inside it look like it belonged. I found my place card at table 4. It was the table in the far left corner of the room, angled away from the central sight lines. I was seated between a second cousin I'd met twice and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be a friend of Sylvia's from the women's circle. The table closest to the kitchen pass. I sat down, placed my bag on the empty chair beside me, and looked across the room toward the main table. Fiona was luminous, genuinely, not performatively. She was laughing at something Sebastian had said, her hand on his arm, the kind of ease that comes from being truly comfortable with someone. Sebastian was next to her, steady and attentive. My father was telling a story to the man on his left. My mother was already in full performance mode, turned toward the Granger family with her most polished posture, gesturing with a graceful hand, completely in command of the room she was constructing. And across the table from my parents, on the other side of the arrangement, sat a man I had never seen before. He was in his mid-60s, I estimated. Silver hair, dark suit, upright posture that wasn't rigid. It was the posture of someone who had nothing to prove. He was listening to something my mother was saying with polite attention, but there was a quality to his stillness that was different from the social stillness of everyone else in the room. Everyone else was performing attentiveness. He was simply present. I looked at him for a few seconds, then I looked down at the menu card on my plate. Later, I would understand that in those few seconds he had looked over too. He had noticed the table in the corner. He had noticed me. And then, before I looked up again, he had looked at my hands. The appetizers were served at 7:23 in the evening. I know the time because I had looked at my watch 2 minutes earlier, calculating whether the dinner would run past 9, whether I needed to move a morning meeting. That's where my head was. Logistics. The ordinary management of an ordinary Saturday evening. My mother stood when the first course arrived. She did it smoothly, the practiced rise of a woman who had given 1,000 toasts at 1,000 tables. She thanked the guests for coming, said a few words about Fiona and Sebastian that were genuinely lovely, and that she had clearly rehearsed, and then she moved through a round of introductions. She introduced Howard, my husband, 31 years, the backbone of this family. She introduced a few close friends. She introduced Fiona's college roommate who had flown in from Portland. Then her gaze moved the room, and it found me at table 4. There was a pause. Not long. A beat, maybe 2. The kind that only registers if you've been trained, over decades, to notice it. Oh, and this is Velma, my other daughter. She cleans floors for a living. The sentence landed the way it was designed to land, lightly, informatively, with the particular cadence of a woman who has said a thing so many times that it no longer sounds like a choice, it sounds like weather. My father looked across the room toward the Granger table, caught Nelson's eye, and smiled the way men smile when they're offering a piece of shared understanding. Every family's got one, right? The room produced the expected response. A polite ripple of laughter, a few sympathetic smiles, the reflexive social absolution that groups offer when they don't want to examine what just happened. Someone at the adjacent table said something to his wife. The moment passed, or appeared to pass, and my mother sat back down. I was holding my water glass. I didn't set it down. I didn't drink from it. I looked at the centerpiece, white roses, eucalyptus, a single candle, and I did what I had done at dozens of these moments over the course of my life. I let it move through me without grabbing onto it. I had gotten very good at that. And then I looked up. I don't know why I looked up at that specific moment. Maybe it was the absence of the sound I expected. The sound of Nelson Granger completing the social contract, offering the acknowledging laugh, moving the conversation forward. I had learned to track that sound the way you track the turning of a page. It didn't come. Nelson Granger was not looking at my mother. He was not looking at my father. He was looking across the room, past 2 tables through the soft light of 34 candles. He was looking at my left hand. I was still holding the water glass, and the way I was holding it, fingers wrapped around the base, palm turned slightly upward, the scar was visible. The full length of it. That long, curved line from the base of my index finger to the heel of my hand, pale against my skin, catching the candlelight the way scars do. He was looking at it the way you look at something you recognize. Not curiosity, not the mild passing attention that scars sometimes attract. Something different, something that had weight to it, and history, and, I would only name this later, relief. I watched his face change. He had been, up to that point, the composed and polished presence I had clocked when I first scanned the room. Now, something underneath that composure shifted. His expression didn't collapse. It reorganized. Quietly. The way a map looks different once you understand the territory. He placed his fork down. Not dropped. Placed. Deliberately. The kind of small movement that people make when they are redirecting their full attention. I looked away. I looked back at the centerpiece. I told myself I had imagined something. 4 seconds passed. I counted them, though I didn't know I was counting until later. Then I heard the sound of a chair moving. Nelson Granger stood up. He stood without announcement, without the preface of a cleared throat or an apologetic glance around the table. He stood with the same economy of motion as everything else he did, simply, directly, as though he had made a decision and was now executing it. The table noticed. My mother's expression registered the anomaly and recalibrated in real time, her smile holding its shape while her eyes sharpened. He looked across the room. Not at Howard, not at Sylvia. He looked past both of them, past the main table, past the centerpieces and the crystal and the careful architecture of the evening my mother had constructed. He looked at me, and he said, not loudly, but clearly, in a voice that carried the particular weight of a man who chose his words with intention, "Could I speak with you outside?" My mother opened her mouth. Nelson, But he had already turned. He was already moving toward the courtyard doors at the side of the room, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been waiting 3 years for this moment and was not going to be redirected by a dinner party. I set my water glass down on the white tablecloth. I stood up. I followed him. Before I tell you what happened outside, if this story is hitting something real for you, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The courtyard behind the William Aiken house was quiet. Fairy lights strung through the low branches of live oaks. Iron chairs around small tables, none of them occupied. The temperature was 52 degrees, cold enough that I wished I'd brought a wrap, warm enough that I could stand it. Nelson Granger was already outside when the door closed behind me. He was standing near one of the iron chairs, not sitting, facing the garden with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at something in the middle distance. When he heard the door, he turned. I stopped a few feet from him. Arms crossed. Not hostile, just the automatic posture of someone who had learned to take up less space in uncertain situations. I had constructed, on the walk through the venue, several possible versions of this conversation. He needed to discuss the management contract. He wanted to address something about the property portfolio. He had a concern he preferred to raise privately rather than through intermediaries. I had not constructed the version that actually happened. He said, "I apologize for pulling you away from the dinner." I said, "It's fine." He looked at my left hand. Direct this time. Not the peripheral attention I'd caught at the table, but a deliberate look that acknowledged itself. "May I ask how you got that scar?" I've been asked about it before, Not often, but occasionally. I have a short answer: an accident at a property site a few years ago that satisfies most people because most people don't need the details, they just need a story to place it in. I gave him the short answer first. He waited. The way people wait when they already know there's more, and they're willing to be patient. So I gave him the full version. November 2022. A waterfront property on James Island, Rockville area. An assessment I was doing alone, late afternoon. A man in a dark suit on a compromised dock, tide coming in, planks broken through, the rope around the piling, the pull, the piece of wood that caught my hand on the third attempt. I told it the way I've always told the things that cost me something, without emphasis, without drama, at the same pace as everything else. Just the events, in order. When I finished, Nelson Granger was quiet, not the polite quiet of someone formulating a response, a different quality of silence, the kind that comes when something long suspended finally settles. He said, "The dock was at a property in Rockville, late afternoon, tide coming in." Not a question, a confirmation. I looked at him. He said, "I woke up in an ambulance. The paramedic told me a woman had called it in, that she'd been gone by the time they arrived." He paused. "I hired an investigator 6 weeks later. The property records were in the middle of a transfer, the chain of custody was incomplete, and no one with access to the site that day could be identified through official channels." He stopped. Then, the investigator did find one thing: a security camera on a neighboring property, low resolution, enough to confirm a woman, enough to see for about 4 seconds that she had a scar on her left palm, diagonal, base of the index finger to the heel of the hand. The fairy lights moved slightly in a breeze I hadn't felt until that moment. "I've been looking for you," he said, "for 3 years." I need to stop here and try to describe what that sentence did, because I don't think I can do it fully. I have been looked at with pity. I have been looked at with the dismissal that is its own kind of definition, the look that puts you in a category and moves on. I have been looked at by people who saw only what they expected to see. And I had spent 28 years being shaped, to some degree, by the accumulated weight of those looks. I had never been looked for. Not like this. Not by someone who had devoted 3 years and real resources to the effort. Not by someone who sat across a dinner table from my parents, who had just performed in front of him the complete summary of who they believed I was, and recognized, in my hands, something entirely different. I said, "I didn't know you were looking." He said, "I know." We stood there for a moment. The music from inside was faint, something instrumental, steady. Then he said, "There's something else I need to tell you." He asked my full name. I gave it. "Velma Bertrand." He repeated it quietly, and then a look passed across his face, that reorganizing quality again, but sharper this time, more complete. "Are you," he said slowly, "the owner of Bertrand Property Services?" The courtyard was very still. I said yes. He took a breath that was almost a laugh. Not amusement exactly, but the involuntary exhale that comes when something lands with a force you weren't braced for. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. I watched him navigate to his email, search a name, turn the screen toward me. The email thread was long. The most recent message was dated October 2024. The subject line read, "Bertrand Property Services, Contract Renewal, Q4 Review." In the body of the message, flagged and highlighted by someone on his team, was a single line: "Client contact notes, exceptional service delivery, recommend full renewal, no concerns." 6 properties, 22 months of work, dozens of communication threads, maintenance reports, inspection records, billing cycles. We had been in a professional relationship for nearly 2 years. He had never known my face. I had never known his. "Your team manages 6 of my properties," he said, "and your work is the reason I've been trying to expand the contract." He put the phone back in his pocket. "I've been looking at potential strategic partners for an expansion we're planning. Virginia and North Carolina, 14 new properties over the next 18 months. I need a management partner, not a contractor. Long-term, integrated, equity-aligned." He paused. I had a short list. I've been working through it since September. He looked at me directly. I took your company off the short list tonight. I moved it to a different category. I understood what he meant. I waited. I want to make a formal proposal. Bertrand Property Services as our primary management partner for the full expansion, 3-year initial term. The contract value over that period would be in the range of $4.8 million. The fairy lights shifted again. Somewhere inside, I heard a brief surge of laughter from the party, the particular bright sound of a room where everything is going exactly as planned. This has nothing to do with gratitude, he said. Gratitude is personal. This is business, and your work earned this over 22 months without me ever knowing who you were. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. He turned it over and wrote on the back with a pen he produced from the same pocket. The practiced efficiency of a man who had been in 1,000 meetings. The gratitude, he said as he held the card out. That's separate. That's just me, finally being able to say thank you. I looked at the card. Nelson Granger, Granger Estate Group. On the back, in clear, even handwriting, a 10-digit number. I took it. I held it in my right hand, the unscarred one, and for a moment I just stood there in the 52-degree December air, with the fairy lights moving above me and the sound of the party behind the wall, and 28 years of a particular kind of weight sitting on my shoulders. Then, quietly, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden clarity that stories sometimes assign to moments like this. Just a slow, real, molecular rearrangement, like a room where someone has finally opened a window. I said, "Thank you for looking." He nodded. Once. The way people nod when words are sufficient and nothing more is needed. Nelson went inside first. I stayed in the courtyard for 2 more minutes. I wasn't composing myself. I want to be clear about that. I was already composed. What I needed was for those 2 minutes to belong entirely to me before I carried what had just happened back into a room full of people who had spent the evening managing my presence in it. I looked at the card in my hand, put it in my bag. I looked at my left palm, the scar in the fairy light glow, that long, familiar line that I had carried for 3 years without anyone in my immediate family ever asking about it once. Then I went inside. The room was exactly as I had left it. The string quartet had transitioned to something slightly more upbeat. Dessert menus were being placed on the tables. My mother was mid-story at the main table, hands gesturing with the practiced elegance of a woman who lived for this, the assembled audience, the social architecture perfectly constructed. I watched her for a moment. I watched my father, who was refilling Nelson's wine glass, with the particular attentiveness of a man recalibrating his assessment of someone's importance. And I watched Nelson, who had returned to his seat and resumed his former posture, composed, present, giving nothing away. He accepted the wine with a polite nod. He responded to something Sebastian said with a brief smile. He was completely, utterly normal. He did not announce anything. He did not look at my parents with new information in his expression. He did not perform what he knew. He simply sat down and let the silence do its work. My mother, I noticed, was watching him with a new quality of attention, the sharpened look of a woman who had been managing rooms long enough to detect when something has shifted in one. She didn't know what had shifted. She just knew something had. I walked back to table 4. I sat down. I placed my bag on the empty chair beside me. The woman from the women's circle smiled at me and said something about the floral arrangements. I agreed that they were beautiful. And then I placed my left hand flat on the white tablecloth, palm down, scar facing up. I didn't hide it. I didn't angle it away. I just let it rest there, on the white linen, in the candlelight, in the middle of the room where my mother had, 40 minutes earlier, used me as a contrast to make herself feel the architecture of the evening she'd built was solid. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the need to make myself smaller. I sat with that feeling for a moment. It was quieter than I expected. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just settled. The way the ground feels after a long time of not being sure it would hold. I heard a chair move to my left. Fiona. She had come from the main table. I hadn't seen her stand up. Hadn't tracked her path across the room. She was just suddenly there, pulling out the chair that had been empty beside me all evening. She sat down. She looked at me with the expression I had noticed on her face when I walked back in from the courtyard, something open in it that I wasn't used to seeing directed at me. "Are you okay?" 3 words. The simplest question. The one that nobody at this party had thought to ask me until this moment. I looked at my sister. Her dress was ivory. Her hair was the way she wore it when she felt confident. She was going to marry a good man in a few months and build a life that I genuinely hoped would make her happy. And she was sitting next to me at table 4, in the corner of the room, asking me how I was. I smiled. Not the social smile I had been deploying all evening, the real one, the one that doesn't have anything to prove. "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." She looked at me for a moment. Really looked, the way she hadn't all evening. Then she glanced briefly toward Nelson Granger at the main table. Then back at me. Something was moving behind her eyes, not understanding yet, but the beginning of a question she hadn't known to ask before. The dessert menus arrived. Fiona stayed at my table. My mother stood to make her toast. I picked up my glass. My hand was completely steady. Nelson said goodbye at the end of the evening with the efficiency of a man who had accomplished what he came to do. He shook hands with Howard. He kissed my mother's cheek in the way that Charleston society men do at these events. He said something to Sebastian that made his son laugh. Easy, real, the laugh of someone who has a good relationship with his father. And then, last, he turned to me. He shook my hand. Not briefly. A full, deliberate handshake, the kind that carries meaning in professional contexts. His eyes met mine for a moment. He said, "I'll be in touch Monday." Nothing else. No explanation for the others. No context for the handshake that was different from the one he'd given Howard 30 seconds earlier. He left. I watched my mother watch him go. I watched her expression work through several calculations in rapid succession. The slight shift of her chin, the way her eyes moved between me and the door, and then to Howard and then back to me. The social processor running, encountering an input it didn't have a category for. In the car, on the way home, Howard asked her, "What did Velma say to Nelson?" Fiona told me this later. She had been in the back seat. Sylvia didn't answer immediately, and when she did, she said, "I'm not sure." Which, Fiona told me, was the first time she had heard our mother say those 3 words in that particular combination. The call came at 8:14 the next morning. I was at the office. I keep Sunday morning hours when I need thinking time, and I had needed it. The city outside the Calhoun Street windows was quiet, the particular December Sunday quiet of a city that is still mostly asleep. I was on my second cup of coffee when my phone lit up. Howard. I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I answered. His voice was careful. Too careful. The deliberate casual of a man who had prepared his opening. He asked how I had enjoyed the party. I said it was lovely. He said it was a beautiful venue. I agreed. These are the sentences we have learned to put between us as a kind of load-bearing structure. Then he said, "It seemed like you and Nelson had quite a conversation." I said, "We did." "Old acquaintances?" "We've worked together." A pause. Longer than his pauses usually were. "In what capacity?" "Business," I said. There was a pause on the line that I recognized immediately, even though I had never heard it directed at me before. It was the pause of a man recalculating. Howard Bertrand was someone who always had the next sentence ready. It was the foundation of his authority in every room he'd ever been in. The considered response, the reframe, the gentle redirect. He had never, in my memory, run out of next sentence. He had one now. It just took longer to arrive. "Maybe we should have dinner sometime," he said finally. "Just us." I looked out the window at the empty Sunday street. Maybe, I said. Not yes. Not no. Just the honest syllable of a woman who is not ready to promise anything and who has learned the hard way that hope without evidence is its own kind of cost. We said goodbye. I set my phone on the desk and finished my coffee. Fiona called at noon. She opened with, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about last night." I waited. "I watched you walk back in from outside," she said, "and your face was different. Not upset different, something else. I don't have a word for it." I didn't offer one. "And then I sat down next to you, and I looked at you, and I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I've known you my whole life, Vel, and I realized last night that I don't actually know what your life looks like day to day. I don't know what you do in the morning. I don't know what you're building. I don't know what makes you—" She stopped again. "I want to know," she said, "what you've been doing all these years, all of it. I want to know." It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't offering to repair 28 years in a single phone call, and I would not have trusted it if she had. It was something smaller and more honest than an apology. It was the recognition of an absence. The first question after a long time of not asking. I was wearing the blue sweater she had given me the previous Christmas, the one she had picked out herself, without our mother's input, because she had seen it and thought of me. I had worn it that morning without thinking about it. "Coffee," I said. "This week, I'll tell you everything." She exhaled, the particular sound of someone who wasn't sure which answer was coming and is relieved by the one that arrived. We agreed on Thursday. At 9:30 Monday morning, an email arrived from Nelson Granger's office. Subject line, Bertrand Property Services. Strategic Partnership Proposal. Draft Term Sheet. I read it once, straight through. Then I forwarded it to my legal counsel with a single line. "Please review in full and schedule a call this week." Then I set my phone face down on the desk and sat quietly for a moment in the Calhoun Street office, in the building with the bronze Bertrand sign on the door, in the company I had built from $48,000 and 3 jobs and a notebook where every total was never negative. The December light came through the windows the way it does in Charleston, low and gold and very clear. I didn't need anything else to happen. Whatever came next would come. But that morning, in that office, I was not waiting for permission from anyone. I was not hoping to be recognized by the people who had spent decades deciding I wasn't worth the effort. I already knew what I had built. I had known for years. I signed the partnership agreement with Granger Estate Group on December 19, 2025. The signing took place at Nelson's office on Broad Street, a historic building with high ceilings and the kind of quiet that accumulates in places where serious work has been done for a long time. His assistant brought coffee. There was a conference table with 2 copies of the document and 2 pens. Nelson and I sat across from each other for the first time in a professional context. For the first time as 2 people who both knew the full shape of what we were. He said, "I'm glad I finally know your name." I said, "I'm glad you asked." We signed. The handshakes were brief and genuine. His assistant took the documents away. Outside the window, Meeting Street was decorated for Christmas. Lights in the trees, the particular low December light that makes Charleston look like something from another century. I walked back to my car alone. I sat in it for a moment. I thought about 20 years old, and $800, and a green spiral notebook where every total was never negative. I thought about the Monday morning I walked out of the Trad Street house with 1 bag and a note on the kitchen counter. I thought about the 14 photos in the living room and the wall that had no room for me on it. I thought about a dock on James Island, the cold, the tide coming in, the decision to act without waiting to be asked. I thought about Nelson Granger saying I've been looking for you for 3 years. Not dramatically, just factually, the way you confirm the completion of something that mattered. I looked at the scar on my left palm. It is, objectively, not dramatic. 2.5 inches, curved slightly, pale against my skin. On most days, I don't notice it. On the days I do, I've stopped trying to feel something specific about it. Stopped trying to make it a symbol, or a lesson, or a piece of evidence in a case I'm building against anyone. It's just part of my hand, the hand I work with, the hand I build with, the hand that, on a cold afternoon 3 years ago, did the thing it knew how to do. My family is still my family. Howard is still Howard. Sylvia is still Sylvia. One dinner does not undo 28 years of architecture, and I am no longer waiting for a single event to do that work. Healing is not a moment. It's a direction. A slow, daily, unglamorous choice to keep moving toward something rather than staying in the wreckage of something. Fiona and I had coffee on Thursday. I told her most of it. She listened with her whole face, the way she used to when we were small and the whole world was still new to both of us. She asked a lot of questions. I answered them. It was, in the way that real things tend to be, a beginning. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you are right now and what time it is there. And if there's something you've built, or something you've carried, that the people closest to you have never thought to ask about, I want to hear it. I read every single one. This story is a dramatized personal narrative. Details, timing, and certain identifying information have been adjusted for privacy.